2 Corinthians 12, if you would. Continuing on, we got a few more lessons here, and it's not what you think lesson series. Just throw your phone around, Cassie. That's fine. We'll just point it out so everybody looks. So it's not what you think lesson series. I think we got like 4 more left after this one, and the basic theme is just the opposite of what you would consider natural is what God expects us to do in a lot of different situations. And today we're going to talk about strength through weaknesses, or strength comes through weaknesses. And we're going to go to 2 Corinthians and look at Paul. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is where we'll go. We'll read the passage here first, and then we'll jump into the lesson. So drop down to verse number 7, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse number 7. Familiar passage. I'm sure you'll probably even be able to quote some of the verses here. But verse 7 says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches, in necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." So we know those verses. We've probably quoted them and used them, heard messages and lessons taught on them many times. And at least for me, sometimes they can just kind of become, if you read through, you're just kind of like, yep, I know this. And you just kind of go through it as, yep, I got it. But when you take some time and look at what Paul is saying, there's some depth there. There's a lot of depth there. There's a lot of faith. There's a lot of willingness to put up with some infirmities and weaknesses in our lives, and then even as he gets to the end there, be willing to embrace them and to accept them and to not use them as excuses, and use them as a reason for God to do more because of the weaknesses that we have. So when I think of strengths and weaknesses, the first thing I think of is when you go to a job interview, right? And they say, tell me some of your strengths and some of your weaknesses, right? And so you sit there, you're like, okay, this is kind of a trick question, right? Because you don't want to be too prideful about how good you are in certain areas, and you don't want to tell them how bad you are in other areas too, right? Because if you say, yeah, I'm just really bad at waking up in the morning, like I need 7 alarms, and even sometimes I still can't make it, they're going to be like, right. Timeliness is probably not something this guy is good at. So you got to be careful about what you say. And so you weigh that strength versus weaknesses. You know, you could always say, my strengths are my weaknesses, is that I work too hard, right? Or I care too much. And sometimes I can be too invested in my job. It's just a weakness that I have, right? And you can use those types of things and say that and be like, okay. And then they're like, all right, so this guy's just a liar. Right, got it. But we think of strengths and weaknesses, and we think of the conflict between the two, right? Like strong versus weak. And there's the verse 10 that we read. But the conflict that is in there, where being strong, you feel like you need to be strong, right? And so if we apply this to your marriage, apply this to your job, your life in general, apply this to your Christian life, well, you want to be a strong Christian, right? You want to be a strong husband, a strong wife, mom, dad. It's something that we feel like we need to be strong, and we have to attain that level of being and doing. And even to steal a little bit from Wednesday night, you know, we think needle movers, people that move the needle, right? They're strong, they're determined, they do. And that is true, but God knows that our strengths are not very strong. Right, even the thing that is best about us are, if you were to say what your strengths were, you know, your skills, or even your spiritual gifts, right, that we all have, that God gives us, the things that we're talented in, the things that we're good at, we can become pretty prideful about those things. Start to feel pretty good about ourselves and the things that we're good at and strong in. But when we have the correct perspective, like Paul does here, we understand even our strengths. I mean, they're human. At best, they're human strengths. And that there's weaknesses there. But then we also do have weaknesses, right? We have areas that we struggle, right? And God allows those weaknesses in our lives because he is strong. And he wants us, like with Paul here, to lean on his strength when we find the areas in our lives where we are weak and that we can't do, right? And then we tend not to look at those things, or we tend to avoid those things. We can even, as we'll talk later, use them as excuses and focus on our strengths instead, and focus on our positives. But even our positives, we know, are only because God gives us the abilities, has given us the time to practice, the time to invest into those things, or the natural talents that he gives us are because of him, not because of anything we have done per se. So to take those weaknesses like Paul here and turn the weaknesses themselves into strength is kind of the direction that we're going to look at. And so how do we take the weaknesses we have in our life? And here for Paul, a lot of people think, he says a thorn in the flesh, so it's a physical ailment. A lot of people seem to think that he had some eye malady or something with his eyes that he had a hard time with. And that might be true. It doesn't really matter what the specifics are for the lesson, but he had something that bothered him, right? He had something that he felt without it in his life, he could serve God better. That was his goal, right? His goal wasn't take this away so I can be more comfortable, right? He wasn't take this away so my life is easier. Paul's perspective was, if I didn't have this hang up, this weakness, I could serve God better. I could do more. I could be more effective. And he even says that it's a messenger of Satan, right? That Satan had brought it to him. And his perspective is, if I could get rid of this, I could serve God more. But as we know and we see here, God says, no, you need that, right? And so for us in our lives, God wants to use us just as much as he used Paul, right? We put Paul on this pedestal of this great missionary, this great preacher, and we think that we can never attain that kind of level of service to God that he attained. And we may not do the same thing, but God has just as important things for every single one of us to do for him that was just as important as what Paul did. Now, does that mean you'll reach a different continent because of your testimony, because of your travels? No, but what God has for you is important in your life and is something only you can do, just like only Paul could do there. So we have to find a way to exchange our weaknesses for God's strength. And there's 3 ways that we can do that. One, first, is we have to admit it, right? We have to admit we have weaknesses. It's difficult to admit our shortcomings, even to ourselves. It can be difficult to admit the areas where we are weak. And it can be, again, it could be physical weaknesses, right? It could be an illness or an ailment, a chronic issue that you've just had your whole life, or it's come on in your adulthood, and if you could get rid of it, you feel like you could be more effective. You could be a better dad or a better wife, a better husband, all those things, right? And it could be something physical. It could be emotional, right? It could be spiritual. Whatever we all have multiple weaknesses in all those areas, and then some, right? We all have weaknesses. And the first step in anything is to admit you have them, right? And understand that there are things that they aren't excuses for sinful weaknesses, right? So I just have this besetting sin. It's just my weakness. No. God helps us overcome sin, so we don't want to use it as an excuse to sin or as an excuse to not live holy or to not live righteously. Not that type of weaknesses, but weaknesses that are just flaws that you can't overcome necessarily, no matter how hard you work, right? I've had asthma my whole life. Is there anything I could do to make asthma go away? I mean, there's things that can make it better, but it's likely always going to be there. And so that's not something I can just get rid of. Would life be better without it? Sure, absolutely it would be, but it's something that is there. And you may have something similar, and you may have an emotional weakness. You may have a past that has caused weaknesses, right? That has caused you to feel as though you've got weaknesses in your life. Now, we're even taught as kids, don't say can't, right? At least I was. We're never supposed to say can't. Those like you get flicked on the mouth, you say can't, right? You don't want to hear you say can't, you can, right? And that's a good way to teach kids, because once they learn they can't, and that means you get out of stuff, then, well, I can't do anything. I can't pick up that toy. I can't come up the stairs right now. I can't do this, right? And we're not talking about that. But God knows who we really are, right? He knows every single one of us. The thing we project to each other when we're here, the best form or best version of ourselves on Sundays, even the version that's maybe not the best that we project to our spouses all the times. We're a little more real with our spouses at home, a little more relaxed. Even that version of ourselves, usually we're keeping some things back. We pretend to be something or put on a good show even with our spouses. But God knows our hearts. And I'm not saying in a bad way. I'm just saying we try to present ourselves in a positive way. God knows our hearts, and he can see through the pride that can keep us from admitting our weaknesses, keep us from actually acknowledging that they exist, but that we all have them. And so Paul's weakness that he had, it was significant, right? It was significant enough that he besought the Lord 3 times to take it away from him. So it is something big enough that the thorn in the flesh, again, he felt, I believe, prevented him from serving God effectively, or as effectively as he wanted to. Felt like if it was removed, he could do more. But Paul knew that there's nothing he could do to handle his problem, right? There's nothing physically he could have done that would have handled the problem that he had, this thorn in his flesh. And think about Paul's life. He had many issues besides the thorn in the flesh, right? I mean, shipwrecked many times, in prison, he was beaten. He says, we go to different passages, that he was hungry, that he was to the point where he went without food long enough that he put that he was hungry. So it's not like he missed a meal. He was without food for extended periods of time. He was beaten, like I said, shipwrecked. He even says there are church problems, are things that he had to deal with in his ministry, in his life. So Paul had a lot of issues besides this thorn in the flesh that caused him difficulty and weaknesses that he had. And God used some of those hardships on top of his weakness to reveal his weaknesses. Hardships sometimes come into our lives to show us the places where we're deficient in, places that we don't measure up to. And it can be, and a lot of times we'll think, well, I just haven't put the time into those things. I could be more attentive or more disciplined, and then I could make those weaknesses strengths. And that could be true in some areas, but there's some areas we're just weak in. And because we're human beings, and because we're not perfect. And God can bring hardships in our life, like with Paul, his prisons, his shipwrecks, the things that he went through, to show us that without God, without his involvement, we really are incapable. We really are unable to do a lot. I mean, all it takes is for you to get some kind of sickness that puts you in bed where you physically can't get out to realize how frail you really are, how weak you really are. I mean, when you get up and you feel good or you feel good enough, you can get out, you go to work, you can just accomplish things. You feel like you're capable. But all it takes is something tiny little thing, and all of a sudden you're incapable of doing anything. And we pretend as if that's not true. We pretend as if we're able to do anything we need to do. But Paul's weakness here was significant. It was big enough that it affected his day. It affected his life. And Paul says his weakness was sent to him by Satan, right? It says a messenger of Satan to buffet him. And that's to beat on him and to beat him down. Now, Paul says the reason that he had this is so that he didn't get prideful. Paul was given a lot of revelation from God. Paul wrote many books of our Bible. Paul saw things that he couldn't talk about. And then think about that. If God gave you specific personal revelation to share to the world, you'd start to think you're pretty hot stuff. I could see that. I mean, all it takes for us is to get a pat on the back from a couple people, and we're like, yeah, actually, I'm pretty good at that, aren't I? When I preach in the morning and the old ladies come up and say, that was a really good sermon, I'm just like, yeah. But the old ladies think my sermon was pretty good. I guess that was pretty good, wasn't it? Right? That's all it takes for us as human beings to start going, yeah, I'm pretty good. Right? And Paul had many bigger reasons than that to think, man, I am pretty good. And so God allowed this, just like in Job's life, right? Allowed Satan to come and bring something to Paul's life, to Job's life, to prove them and to prove themselves to themselves and to God as well, right? So Paul knew that God allowed that to come to him. They allowed it to persecute him because he asked him to remove it, and God said, no, I'll take care of you. You're going to keep that. That's never going to go away. Whatever this thorn in the flesh is, you're not going to be healed from it. It's never going to leave your body. You're going to deal with it your entire life, but you have my grace. You have me. And then Paul's mindset changed. You can see after God speaks, in my Bible, that phrase is in red. My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. As soon as that phrase is uttered, Paul's mind changes from remove this from me, and it goes, okay, so the weakness brings your grace to me. My weakness brings your strength, so I'm going to embrace my weaknesses. I'm going to be okay with them. I'm going to allow them not to tear me down, not to wear me down, not to give me excuses, but to allow me to say, okay, then I need you more, right? He knew that God could remove that weakness if he wanted to, but he didn't. And we see similar things in Job's life. So Paul's weakness was serious, right? In verse number 8, he said the word besought just means to urgently ask for. I got ahead of myself a little bit here. So Paul didn't just ask for it. He begged for God to remove it from him 3 times, to be gone. Paul wanted his problem to no longer exist, but God's answer was not what Paul wanted. Right? God's answer was the exact opposite of Paul's physical request to remove it from him. God said, no, you're going to keep it. So you have to admit you have a weakness. So whatever those things are in your life, acknowledge them, admit them, know that you have them. Understand that there are things that will prevent you from being the best you that you can be. And some of the things you can't do anything about, right? Some things you can't affect and change and just get better at those things. And sometimes those things are given to you so that God can do them instead, right? So like Paul, we had to admit we can't, but then acknowledge that he can, right? God can. So our weaknesses prove that we are unable and point us to the one who is able. And that's the goal of weaknesses. The weaknesses that we have, we should use them in a way to not, again, bring us down, not to ruin our day, ruin our life, give us a victim complex, give us an excuse on why we can't, but give us a reason why we need him more so that we can in spite of whatever weaknesses we have. Right? God did not grant Paul's request, but he revealed that Paul could accomplish greater things because of his weaknesses, because he would rely on God instead of himself. That's Paul. Right? That's why in verse 10, Paul then embraces that understanding. He welcomes the infirmities, right? The weaknesses, the reproaches, the necessities, the persecutions. He says he welcomes them. I take pleasure in those things. Right? And all those things are negative. Infirmities, reproaches, necessities, persecutions, distresses. Those are bad. Those are all real bad. And Paul says, because God says he can, when I have weaknesses, he can do through me because of those things, then I welcome those things. I take pleasure in them. So when trials come his way, when difficulties come his way, he looks at them as opportunities for God to do something, as opportunities for God to prove himself to Paul and prove himself to the people Paul is trying to minister to as well. They're opportunities for God to do something because Paul can't. In those moments, Paul can't. He's physically unable to do those things, but God can. So Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong, right? So God gives grace in those times, right? And grace is just unmerited favor. And we all have that, right? You have grace to get saved. It's unmerited favor, for by grace are you saved through faith, right? It's not anything you have done. It's favor that God gives you, that he had done for you. Everything is on God's part of doing, and you just accept that grace that he gives you, right? So God gives plentiful grace. Grace can be a touchy subject we can get to if we're not careful, and things you can kind of take it places that it's not intended to go. But grace, we have so much grace in our life on a daily basis, and we become numb to it. We don't even realize it's there. We don't realize how big a part of our day-to-day life grace is. And that, again, grace is just God giving us favor. Favor from God to us that we don't deserve. But the deserving part really doesn't matter as much as that God just gives us favor. I mean, God's favor is on every one of our lives on a day-to-day basis. And so that is what allows Paul to say, in these weaknesses, in these troubles, in these hard times, I take pleasure in them, because when those hard times come, God says, my grace is sufficient. I give you enough of what you need, even when the hard times are there. So we obviously have saving grace, right? Ephesians 2:8-9, I quoted that a little bit there already. We also have sanctifying grace. And we're not going to go to all these, but if you want to write them down, you can. And that's just conforming us to Christ's image, right? Favor towards us that allows us to grow spiritually. It's not because we're smart. It's not because we just all of a sudden get it. It's not because we do better. No, it's because God gives us favor and he allows us to grow. He gives us mercy. He allows us to grow and conform to his image. He gives us serving grace, right? Grace to serve, grace to do, just like Paul was given here. The grace that God gives us, favor that he gives us that allows us to serve. Just take example here at church, right? Within the church, the local church that we're in, the way that we can serve, the way that we can help each other, and whatever ministries that we, from anything, from the nursery to preaching to everything in between, any service that is done here, we're capable of doing it because God gives us favor. He favors us. Without his favor, you can't even mow the lawn here at church for service. You can't vacuum a floor, empty a trash, right? The favor that God gives us, unmerited favor that God gives us, the grace that he gives us, allows us to serve. He uses us in his work, in his ministry, the flawed, weak people that we are, right? He gives us sustaining grace, grace that keeps us going through the difficult times, when the times are good, through the weaknesses that make us strong, grace that sustains us, favor that gets us through those things. Supplying grace, right? Grace that he gives us that supplies us with all our needs, with all our wants, with the things that God wants to take care of us with. It is his favor that allows us to receive those things. So God's grace is plentiful. And when we get to those times in our lives, in our moments where we find our weaknesses to be overwhelming to us, weaknesses that really what Satan wanted to do is stop Paul from doing the things that he was doing, right? Just like with Job, to stop Job from pleasing and living a life that is pleasing to the Lord. That was the reason for those calamities and for those infirmities. But just like Job, Paul used those weaknesses to do more. Because God said, I will give you more of me because you need more of me, and your weaknesses make you aware that you need more of me. And so Paul says, I'll take those weaknesses gladly. I'll have pleasure in those persecutions because of the grace that God gives us. God's grace is also personal, right? It's not just generically available. It is. God's grace is generically available. Salvation is generically, that grace, that favor is available for everybody generically. But it's also very personal, right? God's grace is unique to each situation and need in our lives. Paul's grace that he was given here was very specific for his specific thorn in the flesh. He had a specific weakness that he needed God's grace for, and God gave him the grace specifically for his situation and his need alone. That was different from Timothy's and the things that he might have needed grace for. That is different for you and me in our lives here, right? Your grace that God has available for you is specifically calibrated for your need. That's different for everybody else. Because he's God, he can supply that. He can be specific. He can be very specific about your need because, again, he knows you like nobody else does. And so the grace that you need because of the weaknesses in your life and the struggles in your life, God gives specifically. That's why when things happen and God gives you that grace and you're aware of it and you take that grace and it gives peace that is unexplainable. It gives abilities for you to overcome those weaknesses that doesn't make human sense. That's why Paul was able to take his thorn in the flesh and still do all the amazing things that he did because God gave him specific grace to overcome in spite of that weakness and still continue to do. So we have to acknowledge or admit that we have a problem that we can't. We have to acknowledge that he can. And then lastly, we have to allow him. We have to know that he will and allow him to do that. So Paul had faith that God could do, even though Paul felt his weaknesses prevented him from being enough. He had to have faith that God could do it, could use him, even though he felt his weaknesses prevented him from doing that. And that's, in verse number 9. His grace is sufficient for thee, For my strength is made perfect in weakness. So God is saying the strength that I have is made perfect or complete because of your weakness. You can use my strength. If you thought you were strong enough, if you thought you were good enough, you wouldn't be able to use my strength because you would think you have it. And so you wouldn't need me. But because you are weak and you can't, you know that I can. So if you have faith, the strength will come then because of that. So he says in verse 10, or actually in verse 9, after made perfect in weaknesses, he says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities. The word glory there means to boast. He says, I'm going to boast about the things that are weak about me because I know my weakness with the right attitude brings God's strength. And I need God's strength and I want God's strength, so I will take glory and boast about the things in my life that I need God for. Right? Paul desired, that's why he said in verse 9 he will glory. I forget which points I got to put up sometimes. Paul desired God's strength and he made himself dependent on it. Right? So if you're going to allow God to use his strength in you, you have to desire it, right? You have to have a desire for God's strength. So when you have weaknesses, right, you need to embrace those weaknesses. You need to accept them. You need to understand that they're there. And you need to embrace them because it allows God to substitute and put himself in those positions instead of you trying to do it on your own. So God's power can come to your life. His strength can come to your life. And that's what Paul wanted. Paul wanted God's strength. When he realized that his weaknesses gave him the opportunity to use God's strength, he was happy for his weaknesses. He was glad about his thorn in the flesh that he begged God to get rid of. Once he understood that allowed God to bring his strength to him. So he desired that power so he could fulfill God's purpose. Not so that he could be comfortable. Not though so he could just live a good life, although I'm sure he wanted that too. But he wanted God's power so he could do more for God. So he could fulfill the purpose that that God had given him to do. I think sometimes, and I'll speak for myself, and maybe you feel this way, sometimes I'm afraid of God's strength and God's power, because if God gives me his strength and God gives me his power, then he probably expects me to do something with that. I would assume he would expect me to use it. And so sometimes I don't want that. Sometimes I allow the weaknesses then to stay and to be part of my life, and maybe even a bigger part of my life, because then I feel like I think that God can't expect me to do more because of my weakness. And so I'm fine with it. I'm content with that weakness. And I allow it to stay there. Because again, if God gives me his strength, then God's going to expect me to overcome some of my weaknesses. And it's easier to not overcome them. It's easier to let them overcome me. Right? But if God gives me that strength, in the areas especially where maybe we count ourselves out. Say, I can't do this, I can't be part of this because of fill in the blank of my weaknesses. Physical maladies, spiritual maladies, I don't know the Bible enough, I'm not strong enough, I don't have the courage, I don't have the faith, right? I have this physical malady that prevents me from doing these things, and we allow those things to count ourselves out of situations. But if, like Paul, we allowed God's power and his strength to overcome those things, and we allowed his grace to actually be part of our life, then in areas we know we can't make a difference, but if we had God's power, maybe we could. And then God would get the glory when those differences were made, and not us. We kind of take a step back and allow those weaknesses to kind of, give us a wall, give us a barrier. And again, I'm speaking for myself as I studied this out. This wasn't even in any of the notes from the class, this curriculum. It's just something that as I was studying came to my mind, because I know I've done that. I've used my weaknesses as excuses. I've not embraced them like Paul and said, God, well, if I have these weaknesses, then you promise, because these promises are for us, you promise that my weaknesses, if I give them to you, that you will use them with your strength to do more for you. and I don't allow that to happen. Paul used his weakness when he understood God's plan. He used his weaknesses to be more usable through God's strength. If Paul had no thorn in his flesh and he just did everything he wanted to do of his own power, I'm sure he would have done great things. But would he have done as much as he did do because God gave him his strength? Probably not. He probably would not have done everything God had for him to do because he thought he had it. He could have done it on his own skills, his own strengths. But the weaknesses allow us and make us choose to have his strength, which you do have to make that choice, and then choose to depend on it, right? Choose to depend on him and not us. Knowing his weakness was key to God's use of him, he then most gladly took them there in verse 9. He wants us to depend on him and what he can do, not what we can do. Like we talked at the very beginning about not even be willing to admit our weaknesses, because that's, who wants to say how bad they are at something. And we look at our strengths and our skills and we take pride in those. But understanding even our strengths and our skills are human in nature. And God says, yeah, I gave you those talents, I gave you those skills, but without me, those are really pretty weak too. So we have to admit that we have those weaknesses. And then when we understand how God wants to use them, then it causes us to lean on him, to rely on him. Because if you can't do it because of your weakness, you need God in order to do it. If you've taken the step of faith to do what you think God wants you to do, but you can't do it with your weaknesses, then you really need God to help you do it. Because you put yourself out there, which is what God wants. You put yourself out there to serve. You put yourself out there to do for God, in spite of the things that prevent you from being like, I can't do that. But I'm going to still take that step because I know I can't because of my weaknesses. So now I need God. I need you to give me your grace, to give me your strength so that I can do what I believe you have me to do that I can do. And he will. And God will every single time. Every time you depend on him, every time you put faith on him, he always comes through. He always follows through. Right? By faith, exchange your weakness for his strength. It's not an easy thing to do. It's actually, in fact, it's a very difficult thing to do. And it takes you to do it intentionally, on purpose. Sometimes every day. Really, probably every day. Not sometimes. We need God's grace. We need his strength in our weaknesses. Even in our strengths, we need his involvement. Right? We can be strong because of the one who lives in us enables us. But again, it's human nature to use the weaknesses as excuses, to use the weaknesses as ways out, to use the weaknesses as a reason why I can't. But God says, I can help you do anything. So whatever it is that God has you to do, and you need to know that, and that means you have to have a relationship with him. You have to talk to him. You have to ask him. If you have to always, even once you get into a routine, right, or a rut where you're serving, doing good things. You're in a ministry or multiple ministries, and you're doing things for God, and you're doing in your whether it's your children, your marriage, whatever ministry you're in, and you're in those things. Don't ever just be like, okay, now I'll just put it in neutral and we'll just coast. Always ask God, where do you want? What do you want from me? Am I doing where I'm at? What you want me to do where I'm at? Do you need me somewhere else? Do you want me doing more where I am? Do you want me doing different where I am? How do you want to use me going forward? Even in our ruts, even in our routines where we feel like we've got it. Rely on him in those areas and say, where do you want me now? And he may push you out somewhere into a different comfort zone, or out of your comfort zone, into a different area. And then you be like, yeah, no, I think I'll stay over here where I'm comfortable. I've got a routine. I've got it figured out. I think I'll just stay here. That could be a weakness too, because God might want to expand you. He might want to grow you. So you have to constantly be searching and asking God how he wants to use you, right? And as I'll finish up here, God is not looking for strong Christians who don't need him. Right? There's a lot of prideful, and we've all been there. I've been in that because I've been that Christian, probably more that way than others, where I've got it. I've got it figured out. I'm a strong Christian. I don't necessarily need God in all these areas because, I've been teaching Sunday school for 7 years. I've been going to church for 30, 40 years. Right? I've been saved for so many years. So I'm strong in my faith. That's good. We should be strong in our faith. but still realize you're still human and you have weaknesses. God's not looking for strong Christians who don't need him. He desires weak people, which we all are, who acknowledge their inabilities and allow him to demonstrate his abilities. He wants strong Christians. He wants Christians that are being fed with meat, not milk. He wants mature Christians, but not strong Christians that don't need him. He wants strong Christians who are weak people and know they're weak and know they need God. God wants strong Christians who know they need God in order to be strong and can only be strong with his strength, not their own strength. That's what God desires. That's what God desired for Paul. That's why he allowed that weakness to be part of his life and allowed those difficulties to come to his life so that Paul could say, I will be strong with your strength, not my strength. And that's something we're busy. Man, we're so busy today, and it's, everyone's always busy all the time. We think we live in such a unique world and situation. Humanity is humanity. We've always been human, and we've always dealt with the same issues. But as Christians, we can have the tendency to get too prideful that we think we got it, or just to wallow in our weaknesses and think we can't do anything. God wants us to know we can't do it without him, but God also wants us to know that we can do it with him. And so we've got to get in the middle of that. Realize you need him because you're not all that, and realize that he can do with you because you're not all that, and he wants to. So the weaknesses that are in your life, be thankful for them. Don't use them as hurdles. Don't use them as excuses. Use them as opportunities to get God and his strength involved in those situations, and then allow him to do with you what he wants. Don't sit back. Don't take a back seat. Get out front. Allow God to use his strength through you. Admit your weaknesses. Acknowledge he can overcome them, and allow him to do so. All right, we'll pray and we'll be dismissed.